In the area that I grew up in, everyone knew one another, and that's not an exaggeration. My high school had a total of 122 students the year that I graduated, and that was across all 4 grades. And for the most part, that meant that nothing exciting or different ever happened in town, which looking back on it now was probably a good thing. Because one of the few times that I can remember of something big happening in town, it was almost tragic. It was 2007 and I was a freshman at the time. School had just let out and a bunch of us were going to go hang out at the town park for a few hours before riding our bikes home. It was pretty cold out that day, but as soon as we started moving around and playing some basketball, we began warming up. But for some reason our friends, the twins Ryan and Jimmy, were running late. And by the time they got to the park, it was already starting to get dark out, so we only had a little bit of time to actually play. It was annoying that we had to wait around for them, so when they got here, Mark and I asked them what took them so long. Honestly, we expected them to say something like they stopped to grab some pizza or something, but that wasn't the case. As soon as we asked them what happened, Ryan explained that they had to sneak out after their mom went to work because she wouldn't let them outside. According to them, she said that there was a weird van hanging out by the elementary school that morning, and a lot of the parents in the district were notified about it. That was when Mark chimed in saying that he had heard one of the teachers talking about that earlier, but assumed that the adults were just blowing it out of proportion. I guess that's what we all thought, because after we finished talking, we all decided to stay and play a game before heading to our respective houses. By the time the game was over, it was around 6 p.m. and the sun had already set. We all hooked up our flashlights to the fronts of our bikes and began to head to our houses. For the first couple of minutes of the ride, we all stuck together because we had to go in the same direction, but eventually, the twins split off from us because we had reached their street. Next up was Mark, who hollered his goodbyes to me a couple of minutes later as I passed by his driveway and he pulled into it. I continued to make my way toward my house, which was only 2 streets over from Mark Street, but as soon as I made my way through the first intersection, I felt my heart drop into my stomach. As I made my way through the stop sign, I looked down the road and though it was dark, I could see a van that I had never seen before parked on the side of the road. And what really terrified me was that as I rode through the intersection, I noticed the headlights turn on as the van started to pull away from the curb. I pedaled my bike as fast as I could, but by the time I could see the road that my house was on, I could see the headlights from the van coming up from behind me. I decided to cut across my neighbor's lawn who lived at the end of the street as I looked over my shoulder to see if I was panicking for no reason. To my horror, the van began to slow down and turn onto my street. It was definitely following me. I made sure to keep my tires on the grass as I cut through all the other yards on my street until I reached my house at the end of the cul-de-sac. I quickly rode into my backyard and hopped off my bike before running as fast as I could through my back door and locking it behind me. My mom came over to me and began freaking out, asking me where I had been, and told me that I was supposed to come home right after school. I told her about the van that followed me, and we both ran straight to the windows in the living room to look out toward the street. My mom saw the van parked along the side of the cul-de-sac we lived on and called the police right away. Sadly, the van left before they could get there, and as far as anyone knew, whoever was driving that van just left town. Where I grew up in Florida, we all did our best to uphold the little traditions started by the people who lived and went to school there before us. For instance, every year we had a massive game of manhunt that consisted of almost every kid in town. And it was this huge orchestrated event that apparently stemmed from a game that was played by kids in the town back in the 60s, and supposedly every year since. We had a bunch of fun little events like that to make our humdrum town seem a little less boring, and growing up, my favorite tradition was the end of the summer cliff jump. This was by far the most fun, but sadly the most dangerous tradition that we had as kids, but it was really simple when all was said and done. The idea was that during the last Friday of the summer, all of the teens who were in high school or going into high school at the time would spend the last night out on the cliffs overlooking a private lake. And when midnight came around, everyone would jump into the lake to celebrate the official start of the last weekend of summer. Now the cliff that we all jumped from wasn't super high up. It was only about 12 feet out of the water. And for as much as any of us have tried, none of us have been able to swim all the way down to the bottom in that area. So we weren't worried about it not being deep enough. The only thing that you needed to be wary of was a single rock that was sticking out of the water. But as part of the yearly tradition at the beginning of the night, someone would swim to the rock and put a flashlight on top of it so that we could see it when we jumped. That being said, no matter how safe we were, there were always bound to be accidents every now and then. That night, we all got together and began partying on the cliff, and everything was going just how it had the year before, so it was a blast. And when it was about 5 minutes from midnight, someone came around to let everyone know that it was almost time to jump into the lake. I wanted to make sure that I got a good spot to jump in, so I walked over to the edge of the cliff and got ready to plunge into the water below. But as I stared down into the dark abyss, I couldn't help but feel there was something weird about the water that night. I couldn't tell exactly what was bothering me, but there was something telling me not to jump in there. I was so lost in thought trying to get myself re-hyped up about jumping into the lake when someone tapped me on the shoulder. And although I'm sure they were probably just trying to pat my shoulder in excitement for the big jump, I hadn't even noticed that other people had walked up to the edge, so when they touched me, I got startled. My body jolted, and I lost my balance before slipping from the cliff and beginning my descent into the cold water below. When I hit the water, my first thought was that I was embarrassed to have fallen in front of everyone. But when I came back to the surface, that thought flew out of my head as I heard everyone yelling from above me. "Get out of the water!" I heard someone yelling. "Gator!" someone else cried out. I later found out that as soon as my body hit the water, the people watching from the cliff noticed a lot of movement about 20 feet away from me, and being that it was Florida, we all knew what it was. But there had never been any in this private lake before, so we assumed that we had always been safe to swim there. I didn't have time to think about it. I swam as fast as I could over to the shore to the side of the cliff. With each stride that I made in the water, I was worried that I would be pulled under. Thankfully, I made it to shore and ran as far up it as I could before turning around. A few of the students met me down at the bottom of the cliff to make sure I was all right, and as soon as we shined our lights into the water, we were able to find the 2 floating eyes that almost turned me into a meal. That was probably the only tradition that we ended up letting die, because we didn't trust that lake at night anymore. It was the summer of '98, and I had just gotten back from my 2-week summer camp. And as a little welcome home party, my mom and dad took me to the bowling alley in our town and gave me a few dollars to play in the arcade while I was there. Our town didn't have much, but that bowling alley was always a lot of fun. We spent a few hours there eating pizza and playing some games before we headed back to our house. But when we got there, I'll never forget the disappointed look on my dad's face when he realized that our front door was wide open. He looked at my mom and asked if they had forgotten to shut it, but all of us remembered closing the door before getting into our truck. My dad told us to stay put as he went in to see if anyone was in our house. And believe me when I tell you, that few minutes that my dad was in our house and we didn't know what was happening felt like it lasted forever. Finally, my dad came out to the truck and said that the house was clear, but apparently there were a couple of things missing. My parents were heartbroken that they no longer felt safe in their home, but at the end of the day, they were happy that no one got hurt. Sadly, that's not the end of the story. That night, we all went to bed, and I, for one, had a hard time getting to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone had been in our house and we didn't know who. And after hours of trying, I was never able to get to sleep. I guess that's a good thing, though. At around 2 in the morning, I remember hearing the sound of someone walking through the hallway past my bedroom door and toward the living room. I thought it was one of my parents, so I called out to them asking for a glass of water. But when they didn't answer, I began wondering who I might have been talking to. Whoever it was had stopped moving through the hallway as soon as I spoke up, but they never responded. I called out again, and that was when I realized I wasn't talking to my parents. I heard the sound of someone running through the house, followed by the sound of the front door being thrown open. I ran over to my bedroom window and looked out toward the front lawn, and though it was too dark to see anything clearly, I could tell that someone was running toward the street. That was when my parents came running out of the room and into my room asking me what was going on. When I explained what happened, both my mom and my dad began to freak out. My dad ran outside as if he were going to look for whoever was in our house, and my mom called the police, who came by our house a couple of minutes later. The police pulled up to our house with someone already in the back of their car who they claimed they found running away from this area on foot. In his backpack were a few of the items that he had stolen from our house. After speaking to the man, the officer told my dad that the suspect admitted to breaking into our house while we were out, but he hadn't left by the time we returned. And when my dad came to check the house, he had managed to hide behind the water heater in the back room. He waited there until he thought we were all asleep and then tried to sneak out. However, I heard him walking through the hallway.